Have you ever heard the phrase, no one ever get fired for buying IBM? Let's talk about the psychology behind it in this episode of Closing Time. Thanks for tuning into Closing Time, the show for go-to-market leaders. I'm Val Riley, head of content and digital marketing at Insightly CRM. Today I'm joined by Dale Harrison. He is a consultant and strategist in B2B marketing. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Dale, your work about how buyers feel about risk caught our eye, and that's why we asked you to be on the show. You talk about an acronym that a little bit colorful. It's FOFU, which is candidly quite funny and very true. Can you talk us through it?
Yes, fear of effing up. I think one of the things that a lot of both sales and marketing people in B2B focus on is what's their value proposition, what's the value that their product brings. There's a lot of talk, especially in the sales side, around having to show that you have greater value than the status quo, than whatever the incumbent product that's already in place is. And yet, if you look at the high-level statistics in the B2B world, that certainly in larger enterprise companies that are making buying decisions, somewhere between 40 and 60% of purchase decisions end in a no decision, which means that the status quo product outperforms every other available option. And in almost every case, the status quo option is bringing the least amount of value to the table. So why does it have the highest value in the final decision? And this goes back to this idea of this fear of effing up, that every potential purchase option has both a positive value that it brings to the table. It also has a negative value that's associated with the risk of making that choice. And so one of the things about the status quo is it is always the lowest risk option. That basically, especially if you're in a large corporation, whoever bought that thing, no matter how terrible it is, wasn't you, and it's in the past. And if you simply do nothing until you get, transferred to your next position, no one is going to point a finger at you for having made a mistake. But if you make a purchase decision and you replace this with something that doesn't work as well, then they're going to hunt you down, and your career is definitely going to be dinged. And so there's an enormous amount of reputational risk among the decision makers, and you see this within the structure of the buying committees, within larger B2B companies. That there are no single decision makers. It's always a complex, typically 5, 6, 7 people on the buying committee. And part of what they're doing is they're spreading the risk. If everyone makes the decision, then no one is going to take the majority of the blame if things go wrong. The other thing that happens is that there's this strong tendency to choose the market leader, no matter how awful the market leader is. It's baffling to me that something like Salesforce, is still closing, roughly 1/3 of the deals. It is a terrible piece of software, especially compared to the alternatives that are out there on the market. And yet, it's chosen not because it's great, but because it's safe. And because, if a year down the road, that installation, completely goes to hell, then, no one can really blame you because, after all, we bought IBM, we bought Microsoft, we bought Salesforce. If you start to look at kind of the macro level outcomes of these buying decisions, what you really see is that value is a fairly minor component, that this sort of personal reputational risk associated with being tied to that buying decision tends to dominate. And so what this translates into is a need to really understand what the risk profile of the various purchase options are, and how your product is viewed from the standpoint of the risk that it brings, to the final buying decision.
Let's talk a little bit, because if it's not value and it's not differentiation, It's about de-risking. Dale, you had a graphic, and we're going to share it on the screen, where you talk through risk adjusted value. And for those listening to the episode, I encourage you to check out the YouTube link, so you can see what we're referring to. But Dale, this graphic I think we felt was especially compelling. Can you talk us through it?
Sure. And so what I really have here is the status quo and then a set of purchase options. If you look at the value to the company of the various options, the status quo is clearly the lowest value option. So all of the potential purchase options will bring higher value to solving the problem than the status quo will. Each of these options have various levels of risk associated with it. And that risk is essentially negative value. It's subtracting from the value that the product brings. And that what people are doing, what the buyers are doing, is that they're not looking at the value. They're looking at the so-called risk-adjusted value. The value that will accrue to the company if you take this option, minus the risk associated with making making that selection. And when you subtract these away, what you get is a second graph that basically shows that the status quo ends up having the highest risk-adjusted value of any of the options. And again, we know this is the case in roughly half of all instances, because we have very good data from Gartner, that in the range of 40 to 60% of enterprise B2B purchase decisions result in a no decision, which basically is the same thing as saying that the status quo option was the best option available to us, better than literally the entire range of options available within the category.
So when you're looking at this graphic, you see that when you take into account the risk, right, that the options don't look as appealing as they would just to stick with
Right,
what you have.
right. And what this also says is that there should be at least as much effort spent on establishing the fact that you're the low risk option as you spend establishing that you're the high value option. And this is really much more of a marketing task than a sales task, because much of the language that has already been used to describe the product, it has already reached that buyer well before the salesperson has a conversation. So by the time the salesperson walks in, a lot of this risk perception is very much locked into place, and they can fight against it, but it's a fight. Where if you can go back into your marketing and you can, from the very first contact you have with a prospect, you highlight the fact that this is the low risk option, and you have to, consciously be aware of how the risks are perceived. There's implementation risk, there's performance risk, there's a variety of different types of risk associated with, with any one company's product. If the language within your marketing is directly addressing these risk issues and directly, one, not trying to inflame the issue, because again, there is this tendency to, for people to be overly impressed with the product they've created. This is the most amazing thing. No one has ever done anything like this. This is the most revolutionary thing that's ever been produced. And the deal is, nobody wants revolutionary. What they want is the thing that works without me having to worry about it. The words you use in your marketing can go a long ways to either, greatly enhancing the perceived risk or greatly reducing the perceived risk. But the time to make, the time to have those conversations with the customer is in the early stages, when they're starting to form their initial formative opinions around the product. And you have to be seen as the safe option, especially in the corporate environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it brings to mind that classic graph of diffusion of innovations, right? Where, there are people that are in the market for something that might be a little risky and might be revolutionary in early stage, but those are the early adopters, and there's not enough of them really to, have a really profitable company.
Right. And even the early adopters still need some de-risking.
Right. You gave us some tips already in terms of marketing at de-risking a deal. Let's say you're a seller and you've gotten to the point where you're on a call with someone. Are there any tactics that come to mind that can help, like phrases or approaches that salespeople can use to really pull the risk out of a decision?
I think one of the things that's important to understand is where the risk lies. And to a large extent, the risk does not lie with the company. The risk lies with the individual decision maker, because what happens is if you're associated with a failed, with what's perceived internally to be a failed decision, and those failures can be completely outside your control. So for instance, you make the decision, you move on to other things. The implementation team that comes in to implement the solution screws it up. It will still be perceived as a failed buying decision. People are not going to be nuanced about how it failed. And so you've got a lot of things that are already outside your control that are risk factors. I think that from a sales standpoint, what's important is to sort of understand, what is perceived as the risk pathways, the different ways that this deal can go south after they make the purchase. Because again, what happens before they make the purchase isn't going to have any impact on them. But once they make that purchase, that decision is then going to go with them off into the future. So a number of years ago, I actually I worked as a consultant to a Fortune 10 global procurement group. And I was involved with them for a little over a year. And one of the aspects of that engagement was sitting in on a couple of dozen of these buying groups as they're making the decision. And I can tell you the discussions behind closed doors, is very much about all the ways it can go wrong. Now they'll never say that out loud, and it doesn't show up in the sort of in the final language of the decision. But behind closed doors, the language is very much about how things can go wrong and how we can protect ourselves if it goes wrong, coupled with, who's given us pushback and what are what sort of horse trading can we do with these other political constituents that are pushing back on this choice. So we're going to trade them, some future favor, if they will allow us to move ahead with this decision. So it's a very, very complex decision-making process that often has very little to do with the products and very little to do with the value they bring. And everything to do with working within the political environment, the horse trading, and then constantly trying to protect themselves from future risk.
As a seller, would it behoove you to speak candidly with the point of contact at an organization and say, as we're moving forward towards possibly signing this deal, can you help me brainstorm ways in which, it might go south? And so we can get ahead of those and then use that as a way to make the buyer more comfortable with choosing your option?
I think so. But I think it's a challenge to get the buyer to have those conversations, because the buyer doesn't want to openly admit that this is what's driving their decision, because officially, we rationally and objectively evaluated the value that each of these options bring to the table. And, we made the decision based purely on, what was the logical choice among these options. So, there's, I think, a lot of reluctance to have that conversation. One of the things that I have done in the past that's been highly productive is, especially for a very high value sell, if we're talking about a 7-figure or greater engagement, to basically identify a recently retired executive, ideally someone that's relatively close to the group that you're trying to sell into, that's retired within, say, the last 4 or 5 years, and hire them as a consultant. They'll be expensive. You'll pay them, $200 or $300 an hour. It will be the cheapest money you ever spent, because one, they're going to thoroughly understand how the decision making is really done, as opposed to how the company officially tells you it's done. And they're going to thoroughly understand how to think about these issues in the mindset of the buyers within the company. And they likely will know these people and be able to have, one-on-one sort of off the record conversations with them. They're not going to sell the product for you, but what they'll do is they'll give you, they'll know how to pick up the phone and call the right person, and say the right thing to them. And they'll give you good intuition about how these decisions are thought about, because every company is a very, very unique political ecosystem. And I think it's almost impossible as an outsider to really grasp how these decisions are being made, and the ability to bring an insider along with you on your team becomes very valuable. And I think this is a very underutilized technique, and it's a technique that really allows you to get a deeper understanding of how decisions are really made and how the risk components around that decision are thought about uniquely within that organization.
So really great tips, Dale, about insight into for those enterprise sales representatives out there. I think they must have learned a lot from our talk today. That's all the time we have, though. Thanks so much for your insights and for being on the show.
Thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you for tuning into Closing Time. Remember, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, like this video so you won't miss an episode. We'll see you next week.